Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Lit Happens, where we dive deep into text, we talk teaching and explore the magic of English. And in today's episode, we're breaking down Module A from the Advanced English Prelim course, Narratives That Shape Our World. We've got Adriel, as always, with us here today, and myself, Belle. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Adriel.
Hello, how are we all going?
I think you sound like a teacher that's already tired going into term 2, Adriel.
It's a little bit buggered, but no, we're good. We're good. It's an exciting time, and narratives that shape our world will be very, very exciting to talk about today, especially for those that are undertaking this unit this term. I think it's a fun unit to go through with the kids, and
Definitely.
It's so relevant to our world right now as well. Everything aligns with it. So it'll be a fun episode to actually unpack some of the key ideas that we look at when it comes to this term narrative.
I think so. Should we just get straight into then the rubric now? So obviously it's called Narratives That Shape Our World. We're looking at the power and the purpose of narratives. So let's get into what is the module's intent and what does this concept of narratives actually mean, and I guess why it matters, getting our students to know why it matters. I might just kick us off. When we look at the rubric, it tells us that narratives do more than just entertain us. In terms of its purpose, they're there to illuminate, they're there to convey ideas, attitudes, values. And, say to your students, think about it as well. Every time they read a novel or they watch a film or they hear a story from a friend, you're not just getting a plot or a series of events, but you're being invited into someone's perspective and worldview. So I think that this idea of narratives and worldviews, it gets students to really consider how a text and the narratives represented within can shape identities that we have, our values, and even our cultural understandings. So there's that real sense of the power of storytelling as well here.
Yeah, I agree. And I also like this idea when we're starting to look at like narratives, and that idea of storytelling. It's such a powerful sort of quality teaching area that we have. I know it's something that I definitely take a hold of in my sort of pedagogy. But when we're looking at narratives in terms of those stories, there's so many hows and whys and, whats that we can sort of ask the students in order to present sort of, the past, the present, the future. We look at how these stories sort of illuminate and convey those ideas like you sort of just mentioned there. But I also like how they shape us. And I think that's probably something that we're going to key into. So like shaping the individual, shaping the communities, and that perception of themselves. I think that's quite important. We look at storytelling again, as you've just mentioned, as a universal tool. And this is like that role that we sort of look at, how it's sort of played a massive role across all cultures, both historical, cultural, context, I should say. And we look at how it's sort of been manifested in all the different types of media now, in forms and modes, which is quite important in getting the students to think critically. I think it's quite significant for us to consider. So, you've got these modern day sort of things where students are like, oh, well, why do we have to read stories and whatnot? Well, everyone is a storyteller now, aren't they?
Yes.
You think about it. That's one of the questions that I always tell the kids. So, well, who's got social media here, especially in year 11 and 12? And inevitably, all of them will put their hand up. And I said, well, why do you have social media? And they think about it, like that's that pause that they have. And then it's like, well, really, one of the main purposes for them is, to share a story, isn't it? You post your stories.
For expression. Yeah.
Expressing things, your images, your videos these days with TikToks. Like, why are you doing all of these sorts of things? Now, again, it's that story, like, why do you edit it? Why is this, maybe a 500 videos that you might take and you only share one? What is the reason for it? And this is sort of where we start to see these ideas of storytelling really come into play and relevance for our students as they continue to study a module like this, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, particularly with that social media. Is it's important to remind students, not just for their like social media usage, but any story they look at, it's not just what is the story, but what's really important is also the way it's being given or being told, and the why it's being told. You know, what view of the world or what point of view or what perspective, do they want to shape? And it can be as easy as, like you said, getting them to consider the last post they made. What was it about, but what was their intent, and in what way did they approach getting that story out, and then reflecting on, well, the why, what reaction perhaps were they trying to get out of the audience, or what reaction intrinsically were they trying to get from that also. If we were to just bring up some key points from the rubric that relate to, what we've discussed. So we know that there's a couple of dot points in there specifically related to the concept of narrative. And Adriel, you made a really great point there. If you're a teacher, a new scheme teacher who's not really aware yet of the English concepts, the English teaching concepts, get online. They are on the department website. They have some really handy pages and little clips that help explain them, and PDF documents that you can project in the class, but looking at narrative as a textual concept as well as just the topic of this module. I think you're absolutely right leading with that. And so we can see that represented in the rubric through a few of the dot points. We've got, the encouragement for students to explore narratives from, the past, present, and more so how they're representing ideas, attitudes, and values. Looking at stories as tools for connecting people, inspiring change, even sharing collective and personal experiences. And really the module kind of emphasizes how storytelling helps both individuals and communities not only understand themselves, but represent themselves as well. I often say to my students, when we think of the really powerful texts of the past, it's a good opportunity to remind students, I think, that texts are not, in a vacuum, that a text is not only shaped by the world around them when the factors influencing the text, but that the text also has the power to then reshape or mold the world in their own way as well. And so, I think that works really well then on a theory basis. Like if you're doing an advanced English class and you want to look at some more literary concepts and some theory, you can look at the idea of the meta narrative here. I think a lot of, from what I've seen and from what both you and I have taught and at other places we've worked at, teachers really tend to pick texts here that might have more of a meta narrative or a very distinct time frame. So, if you're wondering, meta narrative, it's that big overarching story or worldview that the society tells itself. And remember that novels and poetry and film and other texts, they are representations of society. So, you might be looking at texts that are representing, progress and modernity or the influences of technology. Really great speculative fiction works really well in this module. You might be looking at texts that maybe represent, for example, the hero's journey or triumph over evil, but also you might be looking at social texts that represent perhaps colonialism or feminism or class struggle, so I think there's so much variety in this module A unit, and there's so much you can tap into, and you can ask your students, what big story is this text promoting? So, if it's a dystopian novel, what's that meta narrative happening? And because I think it ties in really well to rubric, purpose, text, and it all connects really, really nicely.
And I think when we're considering something like a meta narrative, really delve into something like this as we're going through this unit. Remember, like you've just mentioned here before, the meta narrative is something that provides an explanation or a framework for understanding history, society, culture. And in particular, this is probably a nice sort of lead in, that human experience as a whole. And yes, the common module might be sort of shifting when your students now undertake the next year's HSC course. However, what we do see is the language often remains the same. There's a lot that's going to be talking about human experience as a whole, and when we consider meta narrative, I think a nice way to sort of look at it, it's a broad sort of unifying account that seeks to give meaning or legitimacy to smaller, maybe individual narratives by placing them within a larger sort of context. And I think that's quite significant for us. You don't really need to go into like the ins and outs of the philosophies of what a meta narrative is with the kids, but the important thing is for them to be able to not only apply it in their own world, but also look to analyze it when we look at it through the text. And I think that's quite significant. And some of that relevance that we sort of see is in terms of our study here is that, these meta narratives can enhance your exploration again of how those larger stories shape individual narratives. I think that's quite significant.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It sets it up so well for the text and human experience module later down the track that also has that really big emphasis on the power of storytelling and the role of storytelling in representing people in society. Yeah.
Yeah. And you got some perspectives here that you can sort of consider. I think you've mentioned this idea of like colonialism, the colonial meta narrative might frame maybe things like Indigenous stories within Australian culture. While, if we consider this framework of postmodernism, you might look at that critique or look at how that critique might challenge, these grand narratives that have been dominant, which is something we'll sort of speak of afterwards. And this highlights a lot of those diverse voices, and it really does encourage your students to then look at, exploring their own voice and understanding the power of their own voice when it comes to looking at these texts, rather than having to, rely on what the teacher is saying all the time about these texts. I think that's quite significant. So we're empowering our students in a way as well by looking at these meta narratives. So it's quite significant there.
Absolutely. And you just sort of touched on it now. Do you want to just introduce that idea of the dominant and the resistant narratives, and we can just talk a little bit about that before we move on to the text?
I think so. So when you're looking at dominant narratives, these are like your stories that we sort of look at being the accepted parts or accepted sort of narratives that are reinforced by, institutions like education, the media, can say mainstream media, and government. These are probably the big things. And these often reflect what we say the perspectives of those in power. That's the dominant narrative. It's the people who control the story. So for example, for your students, you might ask them, well, why do we study this aspect of World War II? Or why do we look at this X, Y, and Z text in English? Well, because there are structures in place, so government systems in place that sort of dictate through curriculum that we look at these narratives within these texts. And this is what we're teaching our future generations. These can be considered our dominant narratives. And you've got some other examples here. So for example, we've got those national sort of narratives there. For example, for us, we've got the Anzac stories in Australia, which is quite significant there. You've got Western beauty standards in media, and then you've got things that we sort of look at in regards to the narratives that are traditional in regards to certain areas of life. So these are the big things. And then you can start to look at like resistant narratives. So the resistant narratives obviously are the counter to the dominant narratives. And this is where that, looking at and exploring of meta narratives becomes quite important. But these resistant narratives challenge or subvert those dominant meta narratives. And they often come from marginalized voices and seek to offer these alternative perspectives. We'll see this quite a bit, especially when you look at people like Margaret Atwood. A lot of her writing is there to represent like that female voice or that feminist sort of reading, should I say, correct myself there, the feminist readings of those texts. And we've got, more and more so in our education system in the last 20, 30 years, we've got, a big emphasis on the First Nations literature, which sometimes looks to challenge some of the colonial histories there. And then often counter narratives and everything. So obviously when you're going to have a dominant narrative, there's always going to be another side or another side of the coin, if we want to sort of look at it, another voice. And this is sort of the way you might look at it in encouraging your students to look at this unit, especially when we're looking at the text. So, get them to highlight, well, what is the dominant narrative running through this text? And there might be a few. And then what are those resistant narratives that could go against these dominant narratives? So, yeah, there's quite a bit to actually delve into when you go through these ideas of dominant and resistant narratives, but it's fun. You can have some great research tasks with your kids. Especially I find like with advanced kids, you're going to have a lot of kids that love their history as well. So connect it with like, those modern historians or the ancient historians, the people that like the philosophies as to like why and how we do these sorts of things, or why and how our world is the way it is today. And, when we're looking at one of the reasons for those questions is, well, because of these narratives that are demonstrated through the power structures at play within our society. So it's fun. Yeah,
absolutely. And you're absolutely right. And you can always do a short text or an extract before you get into your core text to help establish these notions of narratives. So you could look at a text and ask your students, well, what dominant narratives or dominant ideas seem to be represented, and then ask them, okay, well, whose voice is missing? And that might perhaps lead to potential resistant or alternate interpretations. But even asking the students, who is benefiting from this version of story? And it goes back to that, who has the power in the perspective, and that might help them represent the dominant. And similarly, when they're looking at a resistant reading, you could do like an extract, and you can ask them, how does this text resist or reframe a dominant idea, and then get them. And you can even get students to consider what dominant narratives do they see within their society. What are some kind of assumptions or general understandings that society seems to have implicitly agreed upon in terms of who we are as people and how we live our worlds, and then where might there be resistant ideas and interpretations coming through. And you're right, it is a lot of fun when you get into this, because usually within an advanced class, they will like to talk and consider or ponder. And it's a really nice way in. But even if you're getting into the rubric as well in general, maybe just a few teaching suggestions for the rubric. So you can also begin with a discussion or reflective writing task, actually asking students what story has shaped them, or what is their story, what was their upbringing like, what was their childhood like, what is their life like now, and just getting them to really think practically about this concept. TED Talks are really popular. You can use First Nation stories or myths to explore how different cultures use narrative. I really like, I totally blanked on her name, but I think the TED Talk is called The Power of a Single Story. And she's a Nigerian author. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten her name. She's fabulous. And she talks about this idea of worldviews and what it was like for her as a child in Nigeria, but then as a young student in America, going through her pursuit of academia, and the narratives or the stories or the perception she had of Western world, and what the Western world had of her as well. So there's definitely lots of things you can just show for 5-10 minutes just to encourage that discussion, I think.
Yeah. And I definitely think there's an avenue now also that we need to look at when we consider social media and the way it sort of represents these narratives as well, and how it's definitely shifted it in the last 10 years. 10, 15 years, I would say. So this is something that connects with your students. Find something that is common ground with them and really try to make it work. Because like I said at the beginning, anything with social media in particular, it's all about that narrative that they're trying to present. So these are like your hooks to get the kids thinking about some of these terms. Find them, have those discussions, those brainstorms, maybe even get them to do a few posts. Like if they were to do like, I don't know, make 10 TikTok videos of a representation of their current world right now, or the dominant narratives in their world. You could do something like that and get them to like post it up, or share it with the class. Again, depending on your school's mobile phone policy, they may definitely keep that in mind.
Right.
But like these are the things that will get the kids involved. Try the
Fabulous.
things that
Yeah.
keep them engaged. So, a
Yeah.
lot of the times we as teachers can step in, and yes, we want the students to, engage with the literature that we all love, but we have to understand that they are very different. So you want to get them, most of them, with that hook to encourage them, and then it's like they start to appreciate, okay, cool, this is relevant. How would this then be relevant in the texts that are of literary merit, that
Yeah.
we then delve into? So you might spend that one lesson just getting them to engage with the core ideas of this unit, and then moving into like how we can look at them in the text that we see of merit. Your Atwoods
That's
and
fabulous.
and
Yeah.
Zadie Smiths and all those sorts of things, especially when we look in
Yeah.
craft of writing later on
Shakespeare.
in year 12.
Yeah.
Shakespeare,
Yeah.
some fantastic texts. Yeah.
That's a fabulous idea because it also links well with a lot of schools choose to do the multimodal component within this assessment task, uh, giving students an opportunity in a variety of modes to represent that idea of narrative. So I think that's a really great idea where you said getting them to consider their social media, getting them in groups to create a social media campaign or something, getting them to think about not just what is the messaging, but where and why it's coming from.
Yeah. I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, the next kind of section of the rubric really wants us to then consider the context and the composer. So really looking at the influences behind the narrative. So we might look at now, Adriel, how context and values shape narratives.
Yeah. So again, we all know that context is quite significant. It's foundational in the way it actually shapes our understanding of what values are, the values of the composers and the responders. I would really take the time out here to define what a value is, textual values. There are a whole heap of resources online as well. So get your students to look at this. What are textual values? What is textual integrity? Like, these are terms that we can consider, and how does context then help to shape value? So they have to analyze how those narratives are shaped by the context and values of composers.
Yeah.
That's quite significant for students to think about, because often we can get so fixated on context that we forget values, and this is something that is quite significant. We've already mentioned, the historical, the cultural, and the social settings of the text, because they play a significant role in, creating, I guess, what it is. I mean, you consider yourself, if you were to start writing something now, what are you going to be reflecting? Well, we are going to be reflecting the influences of our historical context, our cultural context, depending on where we're from, and then the big one being our social settings. And it'll be very different for someone here in Western Sydney, like myself, compared to someone maybe writing a story on the other side of the world. Let's say in a country like, let's say, even the United States at the moment. It's going to be very, very different sort of social setting. But the students are also going to investigate how stories are reimagined or appropriated, and I think this is quite significant for new audiences. So, especially when we study things like Shakespeare,
Yes.
and we look at adaptations and appropriations.
Yeah.
We can really explore that evolving nature of the narrative over time, and still how those ideas remain relevant and significant, yet how they're presented to us can be quite significantly different as well. So there's quite a few different things there that we can definitely look at when it looks to how those context and values. I keep emphasizing values shape narratives as well. So please don't neglect that part of the rubric statement there.
Yeah, this is definitely a good space within the preliminary course to look at doing comparative studies, because when we are doing the HSC course, module A for advanced is a comparative study. So I think that's a really great tip there. If you're doing your Shakespeare's, you might looking at, if you do a Shakespeare text, you might look at doing an appropriation alongside it, or perhaps other appropriated texts. I've also seen comparatives done more on a form basis. So perhaps looking at how the style of sonnets has changed over time, or poetry, or even looking at kind of, sometimes I've seen teachers pick a sort of grand or a meta narrative and then look at a couple of different text types that are sometimes one might be representing the dominant, then there might be the other perspective in the resistance. So
Yeah.
that's a great course in this module, because there's so much variety. And I think that's obviously quite deliberate from the curriculum creators, because they do want you to be able to use the prelim course and design it in a way that's going to set your students up for success when they're doing their HSC course. So
Yeah.
I think it's always good to sort of backward map and think, okay, well, what kind of comparative are you studying, and could that perhaps be supported in some way in this module? I mean, not to say that it has to be exactly in module A. You can, do a comparative wherever you like, but just being mindful that we're using these rubrics. I always try and remind myself, the point of these rubrics is to set the students up for success when they're in their HSC, and just kind of backward mapping. So you're absolutely right. That context and values is foundational. And if we set this up now and really embed it now, it will save you a lot more time when you're in the HSC. Your students will have those foundational knowledge skills. They'll know their English textual concepts. You won't have to explain it or define it again. Or, you can say, we covered this in great detail. Go back to your notes, and then you can get into the meat of your text and into the workshopping to really help the students get through their analysis. So some teaching suggestions then maybe for the idea of context and composition and what influences the narrative. Have you got any suggestions, Adriel?
Yeah, look, you've got a few different ideas. I think those research tasks on the author's context is very significant. So really looking up who the authors are, do the pair share sort of activities with your students, finding out some important information, not only about the author, but the time in which they wrote, but also that society at that time. I think it's quite significant. So do a few research tasks that way. I think also you can get the students to start writing little short narratives from different cultural historical points of view. So you mentioned before where you might look at small text, so not a massive novella or novel that the students have to read, but just a series of short little texts and snippets maybe of a moment in time within those texts. You might extract it and get the students to maybe write it from a different perspective in a timed sort of manner, and that will definitely get your students to start considering, well, what were my influences now in the way I've adapted it and appropriated it. And it can be a fun activity because they don't have to think of a story from scratch. It's something that they've already got in front of them. It's just providing an alternate perspective. And then after that, you can get them to then go on and maybe reflect on their choices and their context. Well, what did they highlight as the clear value? Like if you were to reflect on this and looking at it from an analytical point of view, what were the reasons why you decided to take this lens or this meta narrative when conveying your writing? I think that's quite cool as well in terms of a little activity there. And then you mentioned earlier as well, pairing your texts as well. So, doing a case study where pair your writing with a classic text there with a modern sort of adaptation. So we just said like Othello, for example. And looking at maybe a modern film and getting them to consider things like how we might respond to the text differently according to the context or the values of the respective times in which these were created.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great suggestions. I also like a short documentary or news articles or clippings, either of a time frame or maybe a more modern clipping, but looking back to that time frame. Music is really cool for this too. I always like that Taylor Swift song Love Story, and then kind of just using that to discuss like Romeo and Juliet and those narratives about like young lovers and all of that, because that's something easy that you don't have to spend lessons on. Everybody essentially knows what Romeo and Juliet is, even if they haven't read the play. Like just little clips like that. Getting them to watch even film trailers of period pieces or period films could be useful, like a Pride and Prejudice film trailer, and just getting the students to, in that short, sharp, sweet moment, try and identify the context and the values coming forth. I think that's a really great list, Adriel. Got a lot of good ideas there. What about moving on now through the rubric, looking at, so we've got our narratives, we've established this concept of textual concept of narratives, we've looked at context and composer and values. What about in terms of the actual devices that craft these narratives? So how these stories are constructed, what are we going to look at here?
So I guess the rubric sort of says students need to examine how textual structures, language, and stylistic features create meaning. And this is where we start to look at, the holistic sort of text. So structures are overall, we're looking at the way whole text is sort of put together, not just, words on a page in a big blot of writing. It's like, well, what are the different ways and means of communication through the way that it's sort of structured? The language, quite important, and we'll look at a few of those features in a second here, and stylistic features. Like, how do they all come together to contribute to the narrative that is being presented? And that's going to be quite significant. So yeah, some of the key narrative conventions include setting, voice, point of view, imagery, and characterization, which I think I mentioned in the rubric sort of system, rubric there. And when we start to take a closer look at these sorts of ideas here, we can start off, for example, with point of view, right? And this is where you might consider something like first person or first person voice in a poem.
Yeah.
We have to get the kids to sort of first be able to identify it, but also, being able to sort of look at how it's, providing something for us. How is it enhancing something in our own world? So, the use of first person in a poem might, imitate insight into a character's identity. And this is where students can, adopt this to explore their characters' inner worlds, enhancing personal connections with that, respective poet at that time or that persona that's being presented. You've got ideas of imagery. Imagery often symbolizes many different things. Okay. So for example, like if you're looking at imagery in a creative text, you might get them to say, well, what is the imagery first of all? And then maybe, is it relevant to something like a collective experience that is respectfully sort of seen through the dominant narrative or the meta narratives or the, resistant narratives within the text? So you're really attributing like that technique to something that they're critiquing or analyzing within the text. Imagery, for example, the use of vivid imagery may be used to reflect community dynamics in their writing. And then I guess another big one is like characterization. So this might be through the way, let's say, for example, like a protagonist is defending others. So they're looking to seek justice, or they're doing what is right in society in terms of ethics. This may like affirm the values or challenge maybe, or, challenge some of those cultural sort of norms. And this is where we start to look at like the resistant narratives or maybe the dominant narratives. What is right? What is wrong? Why?
Characters who are outsiders, perhaps.
Yeah, like these are the different things that we might see. And, students might use, again, characterization for purpose. It's not just characterization in terms of looking at characterization in the sake of this is just who the character traits, what the traits are when we're analyzing it. We're looking at characterization as a means in which students might, question societal assumptions. They might, align it with some of those, like we said, dominant narratives. And this is how we start to get to, align our students' analysis with this module's goals. There's just a few that I've sort of just mentioned there in terms of some of the key techniques, but
it's an excellent start. And then always remember that you can always fall back on the form and the genre of your text, and then that will encourage you. There are particularly, genres that really align well with an exploration of certain grand narratives. So you can always do more of a genre based, like for example, if you're doing speculative fiction, you can do a range of little short, sharp and sweet texts from a range of those, just to get a consideration of the different structures, the features of language, like you said, the ways that characterization plays out. But I think that's what you've suggested is really, really great. So just encouraging the students to deep dive into these elements and also come back to the bread and butter of this topic, which is that representation of these narratives that we not only tell about us, but that then shape our world, shape our life, shape our future. So some kind of teaching suggestions here might be perhaps using film clips or even images to help visually story tell. I think particularly with this module, it's a really good way to get it hook into those students and getting them to see the text, but also will help you when you're going to likely do your multimodal assessment. And so you're setting your students up already with those multimodal elements of a text, so that eventually when they're going to analyze for themselves and then reproduce or represent that, they've got some of those visual foundations. Even encouraging some self-analysis or some group analysis or guided analysis. Or I'd like to even just put students in groups and they all get given a certain technique and see them, they can follow through that technique and track it within their text. And then in that regard, they can then do a jigsaw and support each other. But they're actually, sometimes I think when they get to focus on just one or two, it takes the pressure off. But everybody can use their, combined wit and power to put that all together. Yeah. Do you have any other suggestions for strategies?
I like that idea there where you sort of just mentioned the jigsaw idea, get them to focus on one, maybe what they really focus on and bring it together. Now, some of us may sort of have this issue where it's like, oh, well, I've got a few students that may not, do their fair share. You're in an advanced class. Most kids will most likely, put together. And if you're worried about individuals, look, pair them up. But I think that's fantastic.
Right.
Even like, going back to this idea of just looking at short extracts, you might get like a text which really focuses on characterization, and do it as a class, brainstorm it, put it on the board together. Some of us have smart boards, iPads, in which we sort of can create some of those digital brainstorms. As kids start to read through it, they might add to the brainstorm as we go along, and just really get them to engage with maybe one or two of these techniques first before, going on to the next one. Again, I know this as well. Like, I've got a class this year, and there are lots of times when students have other things in regards to events and whatnot, because they are part of your advanced cohort.
That's true.
So time may be something that we do need to consider. So this is where being focused and intentional on, what you're really trying to get. Like, what do I want the kids to know? Well, I think we're going to be focusing in on, the way imagery is used or characterization is used. And these are the things that I want them to know by the end of the term. This is where we start to really focus in on our, I guess, what are the important things that they need to know to streamline it. And this will help you out a lot as well. So you're not stressed about catching up kids on, 15 different things, where you can be like, okay, today we looked at this as our focus. I need you to go home, look at this text and come back to me. And definitely these are some of those teaching suggestions that we do need to consider. So weigh up your time and really adapt your activities that way.
Absolutely. That is so helpful. Even create a bit of a map of, break down what in your text is kind of some of the grand narratives or some dominant and resisting, and then you can identify key sections to focus on, or key scenes if you're doing a film, or at least a few 2 or 3 key ideas that all connect and underpin. And that way, if you are strapped for time, like you said, you know that it all correlates and you're not having to work backwards later trying to drill into specific sections. Because you're so right. The term just gets away from you, doesn't it? All right. Well, the last kind of section of the rubric is to look at the idea of composition and creativity. So in terms of then how students are reflecting on this idea of narratives that shape their world in their own compositions, we know that the rubric states that students must create their own narratives. It says in print, digital, or multimodal forms. I know that in the new syllabus, there's less of an emphasis on multimodal assessments, but you definitely, if you're teaching it this year, you definitely need to engage with it. So this might be a great spot to do a multimodal text. You can get students to do a presentation and a speech in person if you would like them to have those in-person skills. A lot of schools choose to get students to do a presentation with their voice on a video. So like using slides or PowerPoint, doing a voiceover. But also we certainly see new ones like digital responses, podcast episodes. Even I've seen a few in the recent years. So yeah, one aspect of the rubric is to bear that in mind, that they need to represent their knowledge in sort of those forms. They can refine their use of narrative techniques and work individually or collaboratively to express complex ideas. So making sure that, you know, obviously your grand narrative is the overarching maybe concept, and then what other ideas are represented within the dominant or the resistant readings there. There's also, I think, an emphasis there for letting students to workshop and experiment with their writing so that they can build their confidence. So I think including little writing tasks along the way, it'll help not only break down the sections of what they're learning and the aspects of the rubric, but we all know the more that students write, the better their writing is, the more confident they are, and the more willing they are. And I know it's hard because we've got so much digital media, but if I think any little activities along the way that we can encourage our students, it will, I think, make it seem a lot less daunting when we get to the end, because they are going to have to do an evaluation of how other composers not only have used narrative forms and elements, but have shaped the narratives in the core text that you've been studying with your classes. They need to be aware of that, but they also need to be able to respond to their understanding in their own, I think, creative way.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, when we're looking at like their own creative way there, we also can consider those rhetorical devices that we do want to mention with the students as well.
Yeah.
I think it's quite important for them to have a good understanding of pathos, ethos, logos. You know, what is the persuasive sort of appeal of their writing? How does it engage with the audience and their teachers, you know, who are going to be the ones that are reading it? How are the texts that we're studying have these sort of rhetorics within them as well? So there's a lot to consider there when we're looking at, you know, this notion of, you know, reflecting on the idea of, you know, how these narratives shape our world. Look, there's plenty to sort of do, and like you were mentioning there, some of those teaching sort of suggestions, you know, writing workshops are definitely fantastic. Drafting is probably still a big part of it. I think they're quite significant sort of elements there for us to sort of consider.
Yeah, I think especially if you're doing some sort of multimodal task, if you can have a sample that the cohort gets to look at. I know we do have to be very careful about copyright and privacy, but if they can just cite something to get the wheel going, and then probably I found that if I can provide a little bit of scaffolding or some sort of suggestion or structure, that usually helps, because you always have those students who submit to Google Classroom. They're, oh, I didn't upload properly, and you know, so if I think when I've taught this and done multimodal, I think the years that I'm a little bit more proactive on that stuff, it tends to be a more streamlined like submission and streamlined process, and you don't have students panicking about missing videos or missing audio or missing editing. So I think that is also something to consider, that if you've got a task like that, perhaps you have to give some of your teaching time to that. And also a lot of schools now are using platforms like Turnitin, for example. And so, you know, you need to factor that in, I think, time-wise as well, so that you're not panicking as the teacher, because we don't want to be stressing ourselves out either. But yeah, even I think using prompts for assessment and for encouraging students to have their own kind of persuasive or rhetorical point of view. So prompts like, you know, how does the text promote change, or how does this story shape people and their lives and, you know, their experiences. So even I think I've seen like quotes to do with this idea of narrative and the power and the role of storytelling. Sometimes if you offer more of a prompt or a sort of stimulus, it might encourage a little bit more independent and critical and unique thinking that might give students a more unique approach for their future assessment responses.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, definitely. That's some fantastic sort of teaching suggestions there. And again, like we sort of say to you guys, these are just a few things that we've done in our own time that have helped us. But there's plenty more out there. Feel free to share them with us as well. You know, I think that's quite important. That's part of our journey as teachers, no matter where we're at or what part of our teaching journey or what year we're on. We're always learning, and we'd love to hear from you guys as well when it comes to some of these things. How have you taught it? We'll definitely promote it as well. So, look.
And what texts? I think people would be really interested to hear the range of texts that English teachers across the state are selecting for Module A.
Yeah, 100%.
And just a quick shout out to our dear friend and fellow English teacher, Julie, who said, can you do a narratives episode? Because I'm about to teach that and I would just love to have that in my ears on my way to work. So shout out to you, dear Julie. And any engagement that we can have with you guys, would be fabulous. We look forward to it. We're always so keen to hear what other people are doing in their classrooms. How often, Adriel, do we have a conversation with a friend that works somewhere else and we think, oh, that's great, I'm going to try that.
100%.
That's fabulous, and it's nice to, I think sometimes we can get so stuck in what we usually do and usually teach, and sometimes it just takes an idea from someone else to inspire us to maybe try something new, or even if it's just an activity, something different. We don't always have time, I know, to just change up our programs and all of that, but any little helpful tip or strategy or suggestion can really make the world of difference for somebody, especially a new scheme teacher that might be listening along with us.
Yeah, I like what you're sort of saying there as well. Like, I know for me personally, I'm in a new environment this year, and I'm with some wonderful young teachers that I'm working with at the moment. And I feel a bit older now. 10 years in teaching is quite a long time now, apparently. But they've come up
that's
with
like 30 years in the real world.
Yeah, that's right. But they've come up with some fantastic sort of teaching activities. So, like, there's always room to learn. And I definitely like, okay, cool. Like, I use it. The kids love it. They engage with it. And it's fantastic. So be open, be willing to talk to people, and just, share things with us as well. We're just talking. We love to have a good yarn about a few of these different ideas. And look, we're like all your support. We'd love your engagement a lot more in your sort of ideas as we do. So be sure to check out some of those videos that we are popping up online. I know Belle's done some fantastic things that hopefully engage people, and in order to continue supporting us, just make sure to comment, leave your comments, leave reviews. Most of you are liking and subscribing, which is fantastic, but we'd love to see this grow. And thank you. I think that's probably the big thing. Thank you for just supporting us along this way.
And listening to our yarns.
That's the one.
That's it.